At my 50th birthday party, my husband stood under the chandelier, raised his glass, and said, "I'm leaving this old hag for someone who still looks good naked." The room howled with laughter. My friends, my family, everyone I'd ever loved. I didn't cry, I didn't scream, I just smiled, walked up to him, and whispered 6 words in his ear. Words that made the color drain from his face. He thought he'd humiliated me in public, but what he didn't know was that I'd already started writing his downfall, and by the time the candles burned out that night, his empire, his mistress, and his perfect little life were already crumbling. Because I wasn't the woman he thought he broke. I was the woman who would break him. The night glittered with fairy lights and champagne flutes, the kind of evening I used to dream about when I was young and hopeful and thought love could last forever. My 50th birthday, a milestone. The ballroom at the Riverside Hotel shimmered with gold and laughter, filled with people I had cooked for, cared for, and carried emotionally through decades. My husband, Richard, had insisted on throwing me this grand celebration. "You only turn 50 once, babe," he'd said with that charming grin that used to make my knees weak. But tonight, there was something different in his eyes, something gleaming and mean, like a man rehearsing cruelty. I remember standing near the cake, a 3-tiered tower of buttercream and roses, smiling as our friends toasted to 50 years of grace and beauty. I laughed politely, pretending not to see the way Richard kept topping off his drink, pretending not to notice the younger woman hovering near the bar in a red dress that clung too hard and smiled too easily. Her name was Lauren, his assistant. I'd met her twice before, once at a company dinner where she'd called me ma'am, and once when I dropped by his office unannounced and caught her rearranging his tie while pretending to talk about schedules. When the music softened and the DJ handed Richard the microphone, I thought maybe, just maybe, he'd say something kind. Maybe he'd thank me for holding his life together all these years, for raising our 2 kids, for building the home he bragged about to everyone. I expected tears, laughter, maybe a sentimental toast that would make me blush. Instead, he cleared his throat, tapped the mic, and said, 50 years old, half a century, can you believe it? Laughter rippled through the room. I smiled, still believing this was the setup to something sweet. Then his tone shifted. "You know," he continued, his voice slurred just enough to reveal the whiskey in his bloodstream. "They say marriage is about growing old together, but I've been thinking, maybe it's time for a new chapter. Someone younger, someone who still looks good naked." The laughter that followed was the ugliest sound I've ever heard. Men slapped his back. Women covered their mouths, pretending shock, but giggling behind their hands. Even the band stopped playing for a second. I stood there, frozen, my champagne flute trembling in my hand. My best friend Marlene gasped beside me, whispering, "He's joking, right?" But he wasn't. I could see it in his eyes, the gleeful cruelty of a man who had been waiting for this moment, waiting to humiliate me. Richard leaned close to the microphone again, grinning. "Don't look so surprised, honey. You'll always be special, just not in that way anymore." The room howled. I heard my name, my age, my body, all turned into punchlines. My daughter's face went pale. My son looked like he wanted to punch someone. But I didn't move. I didn't cry. I didn't give him the satisfaction of seeing me break. Instead, I smiled. Slowly, calmly, the kind of smile that hides 1,000 knives behind it. I walked up to him, each step deliberate, steady, the sound of my heels slicing through the laughter. When I reached him, I took the microphone gently from his hand. The crowd went silent, expecting a scene, maybe tears, maybe a slap. But I didn't give them any of that. I leaned close so only he could hear me and whispered 6 quiet words into his ear. Whatever I said made the color drain from his face. The smirk vanished. His mouth fell open slightly. He staggered back like someone had just whispered a curse. Then I smiled wider, kissed him lightly on the cheek as if nothing had happened, and turned back to the crowd. "Thank you all for coming," I said, my voice warm and steady, my hand resting gently on the mic. 50 is just the beginning. The band resumed its music. Conversations picked back up, though quieter, uncertain. Richard stood frozen beside the cake, gripping his glass like a lifeline. He didn't speak again that night. People would later say they'd never seen a woman look so calm while her life fell apart in front of her. But I wasn't falling apart. No, I was beginning to rebuild, right there, in that room full of laughter and betrayal. Because what I whispered to him wasn't a threat, it was a promise. And before the night was over, Richard, and everyone else in that room, would understand exactly what kind of woman he had just publicly tried to destroy. I woke up to sunlight slicing through the blinds like a blade. The house was silent, eerily so. No coffee brewing, no shower running, no footsteps pacing in the hall. Richard hadn't come home after the party. His tuxedo jacket was still draped over the living room chair, the same one he'd thrown down when he realized I wasn't going to beg him to stay. The night before replayed in flashes. His laughter, the guests' whispers, the shock on people's faces as I smiled through humiliation. I remembered the warmth of the microphone in my hand, the taste of champagne on my tongue, and the satisfying look of fear that crossed his face when I whispered those 6 words. I'd planned nothing that night, but in that moment I'd discovered something powerful. When a woman stops fearing shame, she becomes dangerous. I poured myself coffee and sat at the kitchen table surrounded by wilted balloons and crumpled napkins, the scent of frosting still clinging to the air. My phone buzzed nonstop. Texts, missed calls, apologies disguised as gossip. "Are you okay? Can you believe what he said? I thought you'd faint." I didn't respond to any of them. Pity was just another form of voyeurism. By noon, the silence was broken by the sound of tires crunching on the driveway. Richard's silver Mercedes. I didn't move. The front door opened and closed, followed by his uneven footsteps. He reeked of whiskey and guilt. "Morning," he muttered. No apology, no shame. He looked terrible. Tie gone, shirt half untucked, but there was still arrogance in his voice, like the world would bend for him again once the hangover passed. "Morning," I said softly, not looking up. He sat across from me, rubbing his temples. "You embarrassed me last night." I laughed. A small, quiet laugh that seemed to unsettle him more than any scream could. "You humiliated me publicly, Richard. You announced to our friends that you're leaving me for a younger woman. You turned my birthday into your midlife circus." He flinched, but recovered quickly. "It was a joke. You know how people are after a few drinks. Don't blow this out of proportion." I looked at him then. Really looked. The man I once loved had turned into a stranger with expensive skin cream and hollow eyes. "You've been joking for years," I said. "Every little jab about my weight, my age, my wrinkles. You thought I didn't notice because I smiled through it." He shifted in his chair, defensive. "Oh, come on, you're being dramatic. Everyone ages. It's not my fault if—" "Stop," I said, calm but sharp enough to cut him off. "You're not talking to the woman you used to manipulate. That version of me died last night." The silence that followed was suffocating. He tried to meet my eyes but couldn't. Instead, he stood, grabbed a bottle of water from the counter and muttered, "You'll regret walking away from me. You've never lived without me." That made me smile. "You're right," I said, standing slowly, "but I've also never lived as the woman I'm about to become." He frowned, uncertain, maybe even afraid, and for a fleeting moment I almost pitied him. Then he reached for his keys. "I'll be staying at Lauren's for a while. You should use this time to calm down." "I'll be using this time to clean house," I said, voice steady. He left without another word. The engine roared, then faded down the street. I stood there in the doorway, coffee cooling in my hand, watching the man who had once promised me forever drive toward the same woman he'd ruined us for. and instead of crying, I smiled again. Because what he didn't realize was that those 6 words I'd whispered last night weren't an empty threat or an emotional outburst. They were instructions, ones I had every intention of following. That day, I started making phone calls, quiet ones, purposeful ones. By sunset, I had 3 meetings scheduled for the next morning, one with my lawyer, one with my accountant, and one with a private investigator. Richard had played his little game of humiliation in front of hundreds of people. But mine? Mine would be played in silence until the day he begged for mercy he didn't deserve. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling fan spinning in lazy circles, listening to the faint tick of the wall clock and the distant hum of a world that had no idea my marriage had just died. The part that surprised me most wasn't grief. It was relief. I felt lighter, like I'd been holding my breath for 20 years, and finally exhaled. When dawn broke, I was already dressed, hair pulled back, face calm, coffee in hand. The mirror showed a woman I barely recognized. Tired, yes, but sharpened by fury and clarity. It's strange how humiliation can burn away fear, how pain can forge focus. My first call of the morning was to Martin Hale, our family lawyer for nearly 2 decades, a gentle man with a sharp mind. "Simone," he said when he picked up, his voice hesitant, "I saw the video." Of course there was a video. In the age of phones, every tragedy becomes entertainment. "Then you already know why I'm calling," I replied. "I need a private meeting, today." By 10 a.m., I was sitting in his office, surrounded by certificates and dusty law books, the air heavy with quiet sympathy. "Are you filing for divorce?" he asked gently. "Eventually," I said, "but not yet. First, I need to know everything that's mine, and everything he's hiding." He raised an eyebrow. "You think he's hiding assets?" "I know he is." Martin sighed. "Simone, you've always managed the home accounts. You'd notice if—" "Not if he opened others," I interrupted. "Richard's been moving money around for months. He called it business investments. I want you to dig into every account, every transfer, every investment he's made, quietly." Martin studied me for a moment, then nodded slowly. "You're not planning to ruin him, are you?" I smiled faintly. "Martin, I don't need to ruin him. I just need to show him what happens when a woman finally stops trying to save a man who doesn't deserve her." The second meeting was with my accountant, Grace Lee. Sharp, meticulous, and allergic to nonsense. She had been the one balancing our family's books for years. She knew the numbers better than either of us. "Grace," I said, sliding into her office chair, "I need you to pull every financial statement from the past 5 years. Every business account, credit card, loan, and property under Richard's name." Her eyes widened. "Is this about the party?" I laughed softly. "Let's just say he gave me a reason to reevaluate our financial structure." By the time I left her office, I had a thick folder of account numbers and a list of strange transactions she couldn't explain. Cash withdrawals, wire transfers, and a private investment account registered to an LLC I'd never heard of. It was past noon when I arrived at my third meeting, inside a discreet little office tucked behind a florist shop downtown. The frosted glass door read, "Harper Investigations." Inside sat a woman in her 40s with steel-gray eyes and a tone that told me she'd seen the worst of humanity and learned to profit from it. "You must be Mrs. Whitfield," she said, standing to shake my hand. "I was," I corrected. "Just Simone now." She smiled faintly. "Fair enough. What can I do for you?" I sat down, folded my hands on her desk, and said it plainly. "I need everything you can find on my husband, Richard Whitfield, and on a woman named Lauren Pierce. She works at his company. I want to know how long this has been going on, where they go, what they spend, and who else he's been lying to." Her pen froze mid-air. "You want surveillance?" "I want the truth," I said. "Every drop of it." She studied me. "Most women cry when they come in here." "I cried last night," I replied. "Now, I'm just taking notes." When I left her office, the sky had turned gray, the kind of heavy sky that promises a storm. I drove home in silence, my mind 1,000 miles ahead. I didn't just want revenge, I wanted reconstruction. I wasn't going to scream or throw plates. I was going to dismantle the empire he built on my loyalty brick by brick, until all that was left was the truth and the ruins of his own making. That night, as rain finally began to fall, I poured myself a glass of red wine and sat by the window. Across the street, through the blurred glow of streetlights, I saw Richard's car pull up in front of Lauren's apartment building. She opened the door in a silk robe. He laughed. I didn't feel jealousy. I felt curiosity. Cold, analytical, detached. Let them laugh now, I thought, because soon they'll both learn that the woman you underestimate is always the most dangerous one in the room. And somewhere, in a quiet office behind that florist shop, a private investigator started her first report. 3 days later, the private investigator called. "You were right," she said. "He's not just seeing her, he's funding her." Her voice was clipped, professional, but even through the phone I could feel the undertone of disgust. "Lauren Pierce," she continued, "rents a condo downtown under her name, but guess who's paying the lease?" I didn't have to guess. $6,000 a month, pulled directly from a business account labeled Whitfield Consulting Partners. He's been funneling company funds to cover her rent, her car, her vacations, everything. I let the words sink in, slow and deliberate. I could almost see Richard's smug smile while I was home balancing our household budget, believing every client dinner and every conference in Chicago. "Send me everything," I said. "Dates, receipts, photos." She paused. "There's more." My fingers tightened on the phone. "Go on." "She's not just a mistress, Simone. She's involved in his company, listed as a silent partner in a new LLC he registered last year. It's an offshoot, set up right after he convinced you to sign those refinancing papers, the ones that pulled equity out of your house." I stood there, cold spreading through me like frost. "You mean the equity we used to cover his expansion loan?" "Exactly. But there was no expansion. That money's gone, buried in that LLC." I didn't speak for several seconds. The silence stretched, brittle and dangerous. "Keep digging," I said finally, "and don't stop until you find where every dollar went." When I hung up, I sat very still. Then I began to laugh, a quiet, trembling laugh that came from somewhere deep inside. All those years of loyalty, of building, of believing. And while I'd been preserving our marriage, he'd been hollowing it out from within, beam by beam, until the whole thing was ready to collapse on top of me. By afternoon, I was at Martin's office again, sliding the folder across his desk. "Freeze everything," I said. "Joint accounts, business access, retirement funds, effective immediately." He frowned. "That'll alert him." "I'm counting on it." When Richard called that evening, his voice was half confused, half panicked. "Simone, why is my card declined? What the hell is going on?" I swirled my wine slowly, savoring the calm in my voice. "Oh, I'm sure it's just a temporary hold," I said. "You know how banks are with fraud prevention." "Fraud prevention?" he barked. "What are you talking about?" "Exactly what it sounds like," I said. "You've been committing it." He went silent. I could hear his breathing over the line, ragged and fast. "What are you implying?" "I'm not implying anything," I said evenly. "I'm confirming it." "Simone, you can't—" I cut him off. "You humiliated me in front of everyone we know. You laughed about replacing me. But here's the thing about women like me, Richard. We don't break. We calculate. We endure. And then we act." There was a sharp exhale on his end. "You wouldn't dare." "Oh," I said, smiling into the phone. "You've already seen what I dare." He hung up. I stood in the middle of the kitchen, the light from the chandelier glinting off my empty glass. the same chandelier he'd bragged about buying me on our 15th anniversary, claiming it symbolized his commitment to illuminating our future. How poetic. Now it illuminated his downfall. That night, I opened my laptop and started building a digital archive. Folders labeled bank statements, wire transfers, LLCs, photos. Each click was a heartbeat, steady and measured. Each file, another brick in the wall I was constructing around him. By midnight, I had everything backed up on an external drive labeled simply insurance. Then I sat back and whispered the same 6 words I had spoken in his ear that night at the party. He thought I'd meant it metaphorically. He was about to learn how literal I could be. By Friday, the man who once strutted through life like he owned the air around him was unraveling. Richard called 4 times that morning, first angry, then desperate, then quiet. I didn't answer any of them. Power, I realized, isn't always about shouting louder. Sometimes it's about silence, the kind that makes the other person hear their own fear echo back. When I finally did answer, it was almost noon. "Simone," he began, breathless, "you can't freeze those accounts. Do you have any idea what that does to my business?" "Oh, I do," I said, my tone as smooth as the coffee I'd just stirred. "It stops the part where you launder money to your mistress through a fake LLC. A pause. Then the faint strangled sound of a man realizing the ground beneath him isn't stable anymore. "You're bluffing." "Richard," I said softly, "you've known me for 25 years. When have I ever bluffed about money?" He cursed under his breath, the sound brittle and small. "You're going to regret this. I can ruin you." I smiled into the phone. "You already tried. You failed." When I hung up, I didn't feel victory, just clarity. Revenge wasn't about rage anymore. It was about math. Every dollar he took from me would be accounted for, every lie documented, every secret illuminated. That afternoon, Harper, the investigator, called again. Her voice was electric. "You might want to sit down," she said. "Your husband has been seeing more than one woman." I didn't flinch. "How many?" "3, she said. "But only one matters. The others are distractions. The one he's serious about, Lauren, is pregnant." I closed my eyes. The room swayed. "Are you sure?" "I followed her to a clinic yesterday morning, 8 weeks along." For a long time, I said nothing. Then, very quietly, "Good. He'll finally have something new to destroy." She hesitated. "You want me to keep following her?" "No," I said. "Not yet. Let them believe they're safe. The more they believe that, the easier this gets." After the call, I walked to the balcony and let the wind hit my face. Atlanta's skyline shimmered in the late sun, indifferent to my war. People below were laughing, holding coffee, hailing cabs, while somewhere across town my husband was making promises he wouldn't live long enough to keep. By evening, I met Martin again. We sat in his office with folders spread across the desk. "He's been hiding assets under false entities," Martin said, flipping through papers. "It's enough to constitute wire fraud. If we wanted, we could take this to the authorities." I sipped my water slowly. "Not yet. I'm not after his arrest. I'm after his collapse. There's a difference." Martin looked at me for a long moment. "You're not just angry," he said quietly. "You're strategic." "I've been married to a narcissist for half my life," I said. "Strategy is survival." That night, the first real storm of spring rolled in. Rain lashed against the windows, thunder growled in the distance, and I sat on the living room floor with every piece of documentation spread around me. Bank statements, property deeds, tax forms, the company filings with Lauren's signature at the bottom. Each page was another thread in the web I was spinning. By 2 a.m., I had built what Harper later called the blueprint of annihilation. It wasn't about just ending the marriage anymore. It was about dismantling the empire he'd built using my name, my labor, my silence. And I was meticulous. I cataloged dates, cross-referenced accounts, matched signatures. I highlighted irregularities in bright red. I found a pattern in the chaos, a rhythm to his deception. Richard wasn't clever. He was arrogant. He thought no one would ever look closely. The next morning, I met Grace, my accountant, again. "You've been busy," she said, flipping through my binder. "Busy is how I grieve," I said. She laughed softly. "You're not grieving, Simone. You're rebuilding." "Maybe both," I admitted. "But either way, I'm not done." Before leaving her office, I asked her a favor. I want a second audit done quietly. His company accounts, his personal cards, everything. Use an alias. Hire someone external if you have to. I want him blind. Grace nodded. He'll know something's wrong. Good, I said. Let him feel the edges closing in. As I walked back to my car, my reflection caught in a shop window. I stopped. The woman looking back at me wasn't the one who'd stood smiling beside a man who mocked her body and her age. She wasn't the woman who made herself small so he could shine. No, she was composed, deliberate, electric, with intent. And for the first time in years, I felt something I hadn't felt since before marriage, before motherhood, before everything became routine. Alive. By the end of that week, my silence had become his prison. The friends who once laughed with him at my expense had stopped answering his calls. His business partner began asking about irregularities in the accounts. Lauren's name had surfaced in a few conversations she couldn't explain. The cracks were spreading faster than even I had expected. All I had to do now was wait, quietly, patiently, until the empire collapsed under its own weight. And when it did, I wouldn't need to lift a single finger. All I'd have to do was stand there and watch it burn. The following week moved like a carefully arranged cascade. Each knock, each missed call, each whispered accusation nudging Richard closer to ruin. I kept my days regimented, meetings, phone calls, paperwork, quiet coffees at my desk, while the world assumed I was bedridden with humiliation. That ignorance was my ally. People underestimate a woman who smiles after being stabbed. They never expect her to file the motions that follow. It started with his phone. One morning, a message thread I hadn't known existed pinged my inbox, thanks to a little digital curiosity from Grace's team. It was between Richard and a number labeled L. Pierce. Casual, intimate, trivial, plans for dinner, jokes about a movie, a crude emoji that made my stomach churn. But then one message stood out. "Can you cover the deposit for next week? My landlord is being difficult." The number following it matched the LLC account we'd traced. The pattern was unmistakable. He wasn't just pouring affection into this woman, he was pouring our money. I printed everything. Photos of receipts, screenshots, a schedule of transfers tied to names and dates. Each page I added to the file felt like placing another stone in a foundation built to crush him. I labeled a binder, the ledger, and set it on the shelf where anyone who looked would assume it was an innocuous household manual. That was the kind of theater I liked now, obvious but deadly. Then came the board meeting. Richard's partner, Desmond, had been quiet these past months, uncomfortable in ways he'd hidden with late-night golf trips and forced laughter. He'd been the one my husband used to mock as too cautious. But on Monday, Desmond walked into the conference room with a stack of paperwork and eyes that had the look of a man who'd finally read the map of a betrayal. "We need transparency," he said flatly as people took their seats. "There are transactions I can't explain. There's a shell company moving funds under our name." Richard's face colored, then paled, then went hard. He'd always thought his charisma could smooth any rough patch. It couldn't now. The partners voted to freeze discretionary spending. Payroll audits were authorized. The first public fissure formed and widened. Word travels in small towns and boardrooms with a speed that's almost sexual, hungry for drama. Within 48 hours, a junior associate in Richard's firm who'd been friendly with Lauren began asking questions. A supplier called, confused about bounced checks. Lauren texted him, frantic. "What's happening?" He didn't answer. That silence was as loud as any confession. At home, Richard kept showing up late, panicked, offering explanations that sounded like bad scripts. I listened and cataloged. He told me he was under stress, that finances were tight, that the market had shifted. I nodded and handed him a cup of tea. When he stomped into my office that night and slammed down a credit card bill, I didn't flinch. "We'll figure this out," I said, and meant it. For me, for the next act of my life. A small film of pity still tried to form sometimes. Old habits are stubborn, but I had little tolerance for it. The man who'd traded decades of promises for the thrill of attention deserved the consequences, and the people around him, friends who'd cheered his cruel joke, deserved clarity. If he'd built a life on deception, he should be forced to watch it dismantle. Then the press found a whisper. An anonymous email, cleverly worded, traced to no identifiable source, landed in the inbox of a columnist known for tearing into local scandals. Within hours, a piece appeared. Whitfield Consulting. Questions about transparency. It was coy, speculative, polite enough to be plausible, damning enough to seed doubt. I watched Richard read it on his laptop, hands trembling. For the first time, he looked smaller than the man who'd once barked orders and cracked jokes across our dining room. Lauren's posture shifted in public. She used to smile in that way that says, "I own this room." Now her smiles were tight, practiced. One of her friends called me, voice shaking. "Simone, sweetie, have you heard? People are talking." I said nothing. I let the rumor mill do the work I'd started. There's a cruelty to patience, an art to waiting for others to watch a man implode without having to push him. The following Thursday, Desmond walked into our living room. He'd come unannounced, a man in a shirt still rumpled from the drive. He sat across from me, and for a moment I saw the man Richard once joked about, a conscientious, decent man, tired of cleaning another's mess. "I didn't want to do this to you," he began, and I cut him off. "Do what you must," I said. "If he's been stealing from the firm, from the employees, then do it." He handed me a folder. Internal memos, bank reconciliations, a note about irregular withdrawals linked to services that didn't exist. I flipped through pages that mapped out months of manipulation, loans taken under my name, transfers that skirted payroll, vendor invoices that led nowhere. It was ugly and precise. It smelled to my practical brain of someone who trusted arrogance more than accounting. "Why now?" I asked. "Because I couldn't be in his room anymore," Desmond said, "and because you deserve to know the truth from someone who wasn't bought." His eyes were wet. That admission, simple and human, felt like a small absolution. I thanked him. He left, but not before shaking my hand, the gesture awkward and sincere. That night, Richard tried to bargain. He cried, not real grief, but the startled panic of someone who'd been taught the world curtsies to his charm. He begged me to get Desmond to drop the audits. He promised to repay, to sell assets, to apologize, to do anything. For a second, the old part of me, the woman who'd once believed in vows and second chances, listened. Then I set the things folder on the mantel, the one that contained his contracts, the evidence, the ledger, and said, "You can do any of those things after you fix the people you hurt, and you'll start by calling Lauren and telling her you were wrong." He stared at me like I'd asked him to jump into a vat of molten truth. Instead, he fled to Lauren's condo and refused to answer calls. The next morning, the newswire picked up the column, and the firm's stock dipped, enough to make investors nervous, enough to make lawyers circle like vultures. That was the point. Not full annihilation yet, but enough to make his life inconvenient in every possible way. I sat on the porch and watched neighbors water their lawns, oblivious. The world kept moving. People still bought bread, still kissed on porches, still argued about meaningless things. And in the midst of ordinary life, the man who'd laughed at me at my birthday was learning a new vocabulary, consequence, accountability, repair. He would learn to speak it whether he liked it or not. There was no crowing, no gloating. The truth didn't need theatrics. It needed diligence. I had started that engine, and now it purred with an inevitability that felt, finally, like justice. 2 weeks later, the illusion of Richard Whitfield, successful entrepreneur, charismatic husband, pillar of the community, began to fracture publicly. It didn't start with a scandal headline or a dramatic outburst. It began, as most downfalls do, with whispers. The first whisper came from Desmond's quiet resignation from the firm. The second came when a client, nervous about rumors, pulled out of a 6-figure contract. The third came when a junior accountant, the same one who had noticed discrepancies, filed a confidential report to the corporate board. Each whisper was a tremor beneath the surface. I simply stood back and watched the ground shift. Richard called me that Thursday night. His voice was jagged. "They're freezing everything," he said. "Desmond's turned on me. The partners are talking about legal counsel." "You must be shocked," I said evenly, swirling the tea in my cup. He hesitated. "You did this?" I said softly. "You built this house of cards, darling. I just opened a window." He cursed, then hung up. I stared at the phone, unbothered. It was the first time in years he hadn't controlled the conversation. The next morning, Harper dropped by unannounced, trench coat still damp from the rain. She placed a manila envelope on my counter. "Everything you asked for," she said. "You were right. He's been laundering money through 3 separate LLCs, all tied to fake consulting invoices. Everyone approved under his digital signature." She paused before leaving. "You've got him. Cornered, Simone. You could bury him with this." "I don't want to bury him," I said, sliding the envelope open. "I want him awake when the dirt hits." By the following week, Lauren's perfect facade cracked too. She was photographed arguing with Richard outside a restaurant, the kind of photo tabloids love, the kind where mascara streaks down a trembling face. Within hours, whispers turned into gossip blogs. "The Mistress of a Fallen Man," that's how they titled it. I didn't need to lift a finger. The world does its own storytelling when hypocrisy smells fresh. But privately, I wasn't gloating. There's a strange stillness that comes when vengeance finally stops being a fantasy and becomes your day-to-day reality. I cooked my own meals again. I slept through the night. The house, once echoing with arguments and charm turned sour, now hummed with quiet order. The irony was that Richard still believed he could fix it. Narcissists don't understand endings. They think every chapter bends toward their apology. So when he showed up at my door on a Sunday morning, I wasn't surprised. He looked thinner, gray around the eyes, wearing the same suit from his last public event. "They're threatening an audit," he said, voice shaking. "The board, the IRS, I could lose everything." "You already did," I replied. "Please," he said, "help me. You know how to handle paperwork. If you just talk to Martin." I stepped closer, calm. "Martin is preparing the divorce petition," I said. "He's also compiling evidence for financial fraud. You might want to get your own lawyer." He blinked, as though the words didn't compute. "You wouldn't do that to me." "I'm not doing anything to you, Richard. I'm letting your choices arrive at their destination." He stood there, rain pooling at his feet, face twisted in disbelief. Then came the line that sealed his fate. "I made you who you are." I almost laughed. "No," I said quietly. "You made me forget who I was. I'm just correcting that." He left without another word. That was the last time he set foot in that house. Over the next month, the collapse became public record. The firm issued a statement. "Mr. Whitfield has stepped down pending investigation." The press pounced. TV hosts who once invited us to charity galas now discussed the cautionary tale of greed and vanity. Friends who'd clink glasses with him at my birthday unfriended him online like rats leaving a sinking ship. The condo he'd rented for Lauren was repossessed, his accounts drained by legal fees. Even the Mercedes, his status symbol, was towed one afternoon while he stood helpless on the curb. I watched that video online later, sent anonymously, his face twisted in rage and humiliation. It should have satisfied me. It didn't. Justice, I was learning, is quieter than revenge. And lonelier, too. One evening, Harper came by again. She'd been keeping tabs even after the job was done. "He's sold his shares," she said. "Word is he's leaving the city." "Good," I said. "Most people ask me when it'll feel better," she added. "You're not asking." "Because it already does," I said, then paused, but not in the way I expected. That night, I took the binder, the ledger, and placed it in my safe. I didn't need it anymore. It wasn't just evidence, it was a relic. Proof that the woman who'd once been humiliated in front of everyone had become someone capable of building an entire plan in silence and executing it flawlessly. Outside, thunder rolled over the city again, the same kind of storm that had raged the night I began this quiet war. I stepped onto the balcony, letting the rain kiss my skin, and whispered to the night, "Happy belated birthday to me." Richard's empire was gone, his name now synonymous with scandal. But mine? Mine was just beginning to mean something again. The silence that followed his downfall was the strangest part. For months, my world had been a storm. Calls, meetings, legal filings, messages laced with rage or pity. Now there was nothing, just quiet. A long, echoing kind of quiet that made you hear your own breathing. The newspapers stopped calling. The investigators finished their reports. The firm restructured, distancing itself from his name like it was toxic waste. Lauren disappeared from the city. Some said she left the country, others said she was living with relatives up north, waiting out the shame. I didn't care either way. What mattered was that for the first time in 25 years, my life belonged only to me. I spent my mornings in the garden, pruning the roses that had always bloomed too wild. The scent of them filled the air, sharp, almost defiant. There was something healing in that kind of control. Every cut, every trimmed thorn was a small declaration. I decide what grows here now, but peace has a way of being tested. 3 weeks after Richard's final fall from grace, a letter arrived, handwritten, his script. Arrogant as ever, slanted and neat. I stared at the envelope for a long time before opening it. "Simone, you won. I hope you're proud. Everything is gone. The firm, the money, my reputation. I can't walk down the street without seeing the disgust in people's eyes. You've taken everything from me. But you should know this. I still don't regret leaving you. You were cold long before I strayed. You were safe, predictable. You made me feel like a paycheck, not a man. Maybe you got what you wanted, to prove you're smarter than everyone. Congratulations. Enjoy your empty victory. Richard." I read it twice, then folded it neatly and slid it into the fireplace. The paper curled and blackened, words dissolving into ash. He still didn't understand. It had never been about winning. It was about truth. I thought that was the end of it. But life, I've learned, never closes a door without testing whether you'll still flinch when it knocks again. The next day, a call came from an unknown number. When I answered, it was a voice I hadn't expected to hear. "Mrs. Whitfield?" The tone was gentle, cautious. "This is Detective Harris with the Atlanta Financial Crimes Unit. We're finalizing our case against your husband. We may need you to testify." I gripped the phone tighter. "Testify?" "Yes, ma'am. Your documentation was instrumental in exposing the fraud, but the DA wants to hear, in your own words, how those accounts were managed. It'll make the case airtight." A long pause stretched between us. I could hear my own heartbeat. "When?" I asked finally. "Next week," he said. "And Mrs. Whitfield, thank you. Most people never come forward. You did the right thing." The right thing. I thought about those words for the rest of the night. Right for whom? For justice, yes. But there's nothing righteous about watching a man you once loved spiral into ruin, even when he deserved it. Justice doesn't soothe the ache left behind, it just disinfects it. When I took the stand the following week, the courtroom was quiet enough to hear every breath. Richard sat at the defense table, thinner now, eyes hollow. The arrogance was gone. The man who once laughed into microphones looked like he hadn't slept in weeks. Our eyes met only once. For a heartbeat, I saw the flicker of the man I'd once loved, the one who used to kiss my wrist when he thought I was asleep, who used to plan road trips and leave me little notes on the fridge. Then the image shattered under the weight of reality. That man had died long ago, buried under his own vanity. The prosecutor asked questions. I answered each with precision, calm, controlled. I didn't tremble, didn't cry. I simply spoke the truth, the dates, the numbers, the accounts. Facts have a strange way of sounding cruel when they're stripped of emotion. When it was over, I stepped down from the stand, passed by Richard, and paused just long enough to say quietly, "This is the only thing I ever wanted from you. Honesty." He didn't look up. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed, shouting questions, shoving microphones. "Mrs. Whitfield, how does it feel?" Was this revenge? Do you feel vindicated? I smiled faintly, not for them, but for myself. "It feels like peace," I said, and walked away. That night, I poured a glass of wine and sat on the porch, watching the sun melt behind the skyline. The air was warm, soft, almost forgiving. My roses glowed gold in the evening light. Somewhere downtown, lawyers and bankers were closing out their day, gossiping about the scandal that had already begun to fade from public memory. I didn't need anyone to remember. Some stories don't need to be immortalized, they just need to end. When I went inside, I passed the mirror in the hallway and stopped. The woman reflected there looked older. Yes, but there was something new in her eyes. Clarity. I traced my reflection's smile. Faint but real. For years, I had been his wife, his shadow, his punchline. Now, I was something else, something whole. I whispered it out loud just to hear it take shape. I'm free. And for the first time since that cursed birthday, the word didn't sound like defiance. It sounded like peace. The trial ended faster than I expected. 3 days of testimonies, a stack of financial evidence, and a jury that didn't even need to deliberate overnight. The verdict came on a Thursday afternoon under the soft hum of the courtroom's ceiling fans. Guilty on all counts. Wire fraud, embezzlement, falsification of records. Each word landed with the dull precision of a hammer, driving in the final nail. Richard didn't react. He just sat there, hands clasped together, staring at the table in front of him as if trying to count invisible blessings. The man who once boasted that he could talk his way out of anything didn't say a single word in his own defense. When the judge read out the sentence, 8 years with the possibility of parole after 5, he nodded, slow and hollow. When I left the courthouse, the air felt lighter, the sky clearer, but it wasn't triumph I felt. It was grief. Not for him, but for the years I'd given away. For the young woman who believed in forever, in compromise, in second chances. She'd been loyal to a ghost long before she ever realized he was gone. That night, I drove out to the lake, the same one where we used to picnic when the kids were small. The water shimmered under the moonlight, still and endless. I parked, took off my shoes, and stepped into the cool sand. I had brought with me a small box. Inside were fragments of our life, a photo from our wedding, the cufflinks I'd bought him for his first promotion, a birthday card he'd once written that said, "I'll love you even when we're wrinkled and gray." I struck a match and held it to the corner of the card. The paper caught, slowly curling and darkening before bursting into a small, hungry flame. I dropped it into the sand and watched it consume everything inside the box. The smoke rose in twisting ribbons that disappeared into the night sky, like it was carrying away the last trace of who we used to be. When it was done, I whispered, "Rest in peace," not to him, but to the life I'd finally buried. The months that followed moved quietly. People still gossiped. They always do. But eventually they found new scandals, fresher wounds to feed on. The invitations stopped coming, but that didn't bother me. I wasn't interested in pretending anymore. I sold the house, the one we built together, the one that still smelled faintly of bourbon and expensive regret, and bought a smaller place on the edge of town, a white cottage with ivy on the porch and a creaky swing that faced the sunrise. It wasn't grand, but it was mine. Every nail, every corner, every morning silence belonged to me. The first night I slept there, I woke up at 3 a.m. and couldn't go back to sleep. The habit of worry doesn't die easily. I walked outside and sat on the porch swing, listening to the crickets. There, under the wide southern moon, I realized I wasn't waiting for anything anymore. Not for an apology, not for closure, not even for peace. I already had it. It lived in the quiet, in the absence of his voice. One afternoon, my daughter Ava came to visit. We hadn't spoken much since the trial. She'd been hurt, confused, angry at both of us in ways I couldn't blame her for. She stood on the porch, arms crossed, the same stubborn chin she'd inherited from her father tilted high. "Mom," she said, "I don't know how to feel about any of this." "You don't have to know," I said gently. "Just feel whatever's true for you." She looked away. "I hate what he did, but he's still my dad." "I know." "Do you hate him?" I thought about it. "No, hate is heavy. I carried enough of that already." She nodded slowly, eyes glistening. Then, after a pause, she said, "You were incredible in court. Strong. I don't know if I could have done what you did." I smiled faintly. "You could. You just haven't had to yet." We sat together for a while, watching the light change on the horizon. Before she left, she hugged me tightly, the kind of hug that meant she understood, even if she didn't have the words yet. When her car disappeared down the road, I exhaled a breath I'd been holding for years. Weeks later, a letter arrived from the prison. No return address, but I recognized the handwriting instantly. For a long time, I didn't open it. I kept it in a drawer beside my bed, untouched. But curiosity, that old seducer, has a way of wearing you down. "Simone, I don't expect forgiveness. I don't even expect you to read this. I've been sober for 48 days. It's strange how clear things become when the noise stops. I thought power made me untouchable, but the truth is, I was just afraid of getting old, of being ordinary, of watching myself fade. You didn't deserve what I did to you. I see that now. I see a lot of things. I hope someday you find happiness that doesn't have my shadow in it." I folded the letter, slid it back into the envelope, and tucked it into the back of a drawer. I didn't forgive him, not exactly. But I didn't hate him anymore either. The fire had burned clean. When I went to bed that night, I dreamed of my old self. The woman in the gold dress at her 50th birthday, smiling through humiliation. Only this time, when Richard took the microphone and began his cruel speech, she didn't stand frozen. She turned, walked out the door, and never looked back. In the dream, the guests were still, laughing when she disappeared, unaware that the woman they'd mocked had just rewritten the ending. And when I woke up, I realized I already had. It's strange how quickly the world moves on after your private apocalypse. The same people who had once gasped and whispered behind manicured hands at my humiliation now waved politely when they saw me at the market, as if none of it had ever happened. I'd become something else in their eyes, an object of fascination turned into quiet myth. The woman who destroyed her cheating husband, they said, the one who didn't cry. But I wasn't destroyed. I was rebuilding. Slowly, deliberately, beautifully. The cottage became my sanctuary. I painted the walls soft cream, filled every shelf with books I'd been too busy to read, and filled the garden with herbs and wildflowers instead of roses. I'd had enough of pruning things that needed control. I wanted life that grew freely. Mornings started with silence. No news channels blaring, no footsteps pacing, no tension disguised as routine. Just the hum of the kettle, the scent of lemon balm, and the sunlight spilling through linen curtains. I found work again, consulting for small businesses, something I'd done years ago before Richard's firm swallowed my career into his orbit. It felt good to use my mind again, to be valued for what I built rather than what I maintained. My first client was a young couple opening a bakery downtown. They reminded me of who I used to be, naive, hopeful, brimming with big dreams. Helping them succeed felt like rewiring a part of myself I'd neglected for too long. Some evenings, when the work was done, I'd walk to the nearby park. The lake there was smaller than the one Richard and I used to visit, but its reflection was clearer, untouched by ghosts. I'd sit on a bench with my notebook, jotting thoughts not meant for anyone else to read, just fragments of peace, fragments of me. One afternoon in early spring, I ran into Desmond outside a cafe. He looked older, too, grayer, thinner, but softer somehow. The kind of man who'd survived something and learned grace on the other side. "Simone," he said, standing awkwardly, coffee in hand, "you look good." I smiled. "That's because I am." He hesitated, then added, "I wanted to say thank you. If you hadn't exposed what Richard was doing, I might still be stuck inside that mess. You saved more people than you know." I tilted my head. "I didn't do it to save anyone." "I know," he said, "but you did anyway." We talked for a while, about business, about life after chaos. Before he left, he said quietly, "If you ever need anything, even just company, call me." It wasn't a flirtation. It was something gentler, recognition between two people who had seen the wreckage and chosen to walk, not wallow. When he left, I realized I didn't feel that old ache of loneliness anymore. For the first time in years, I didn't crave validation or attention. I craved peace, and I had it. A few weeks later, I visited the prison. I hadn't planned to, but closure has its own gravity. It pulls you toward unfinished conversations. The visit room was sterile, humming with fluorescent lights. Richard looked smaller behind the glass, his hair mostly gray now, his face etched with the fatigue of a man who'd lost every illusion of control. When he picked up the phone, his hand trembled. "You came," he said. "I did," I replied. "Why?" "Because you wrote me, and because I needed to see the man I once loved, one last time without the noise." He nodded slowly, eyes glistening. "You look different." "I am different." We sat in silence for a moment. Then he whispered, "Do you ever miss it? Us?" I thought about it. "No," I said softly, "but sometimes I miss who I thought we were." He swallowed hard. "I don't expect forgiveness." "Good," I said, "because forgiveness isn't what you need. Understanding is." He blinked. "And what do you need?" I smiled faintly. "Nothing from you." The buzzer sounded, signaling the end of visitation. He pressed his hand against the glass. For a fleeting moment, I almost reached back, but stopped. Some ghosts aren't meant to be touched again. I stood, gave him a small nod, and walked away. Outside, the air felt lighter. The sky was blinding blue. I sat in my car for a while, staring at the prison gates in the rearview mirror. Then, without fanfare, I whispered, "Goodbye, Richard." It wasn't bitter. It wasn't triumphant. It was simply final. That evening, I lit a candle on my kitchen table, the same way I used to light one for anniversaries. Only this time, I lit it for myself, for surviving, for enduring, for becoming something he could neither define nor destroy. I raised my glass of wine to the empty room and said softly, "To the woman who walked away whole." The flame flickered, steady and golden, reflecting in the window beside me. And in that reflection, I didn't see the woman who'd been humiliated at 50. I saw the woman who rose at 51, and she was radiant. By the time summer came, the world had stopped using my name in past tense. I wasn't that woman anymore, not the wife who got even, not the humiliated birthday girl. I was simply Simone, just my name, just myself, and that was more than enough. The heat came early that year, thick and heavy, coating the afternoons in a syrupy haze. I spent most of my days barefoot in the garden, dirt under my nails, sunlight on my shoulders. There was something deeply human about rebuilding from soil, pulling weeds, planting new life, knowing exactly what each seed would become. I'd started writing again, not just notes in a journal, but stories, reflections, essays, fragments of the truths women rarely say aloud. I wrote about aging, without apology, about loving and losing without shame, about standing in the ashes of your own ruin and realizing you're not ruined at all. I didn't write for an audience. I wrote to remind myself that silence was never strength. It was survival. And I was done surviving. I was finally living. One evening, I was sitting on the porch with a cup of tea when my son, Ethan, called. He'd moved to Chicago after the trial, chasing a promotion and distance. For months, we'd spoken in short bursts, polite updates, cautious love. But that night, his voice sounded softer. "Mom," he said, "I've been thinking about everything that happened, about Dad." I exhaled slowly. That's a heavy thing to carry. "I know," he said, "but I also wanted to say, you were right to do what you did. I used to think revenge was ugly. But what you did wasn't revenge, was it?" "No," I said quietly. "It was correction." He was silent for a while, then laughed lightly. "You always did fix things." "Not this time," I said. "This time, I just let what was broken stay broken." He chuckled again, softer now. "I'm proud of you, Mom." Those words, so simple, landed like sunlight after a long storm. After we hung up, I sat there watching the horizon fade from gold to violet. Somewhere in the distance, fireworks cracked the air. Someone celebrating something. And I smiled, because in my own quiet way, I was celebrating too. Later that week, I attended a small community fundraiser at the library. Nothing grand. Local artists, homemade pies, small-town charm. I hadn't been in a crowd since the trial. I expected the usual tight smiles, the polite distance people reserve for those who make them uncomfortable with their resilience. But something was different. People came up to me. Women mostly, though a few men too. "You don't know me," one woman said, "but I watched what you went through, and seeing you handle it gave me courage to leave my husband." Another whispered, "You didn't just take your life back. You showed the rest of us how." I wasn't prepared for that kind of quiet reverence. I had done what I did for survival, not inspiration. But standing there, hearing those words, I realized something profound. My story wasn't just mine anymore. It was a map, a warning, a spark. When I got home that night, I sat at my desk, opened my notebook, and wrote at the top of a fresh page, "The rebirth of the woman they tried to break." And beneath it, I wrote the first line that came to me. They thought humiliation would silence her, but it only taught her how to speak without shaking. Weeks turned into months. The rhythm of my days became steady, almost sacred. Mornings for writing, afternoons for the garden, evenings for walks or long conversations with friends I hadn't realized I'd missed. Occasionally, I'd still think of Richard, not with anger, not even with sorrow, just with a detached curiosity, like remembering an old house you once lived in before it burned down. Sometimes I imagined him in that prison cell, finally stripped of the masks he'd worn all his life. Maybe he was learning humility. Maybe he wasn't. It didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that his voice no longer echoed in my head when I looked in the mirror. I had replaced the reflection he'd distorted with one of my own choosing. One afternoon, while tidying the small studio I'd converted into a writing room, I found something wedged between two old books, a folded piece of paper, browned with age. It was a note from myself, written years ago, back when I was still clinging to the fantasy that love could fix everything. The handwriting was younger, rounder. It said, "If it ever gets too hard to recognize yourself, remember, you were whole before anyone tried to name you." I stared at it for a long time. Then, slowly, I smiled. That evening, I walked down to the lake behind my house. The water rippled with the late summer breeze. I tore the note into tiny pieces and let them drift across the surface. They floated, scattered, and then disappeared into the water's shimmer. I whispered, "I recognize her now." That night, as I climbed into bed, I realized I no longer dreamed of the birthday party. That awful moment, the laughter, the spotlight, his cruel joke, had finally faded into something small, just a memory, not a wound. The last thing I thought before falling asleep was simple, almost childlike in its peace. I made it through. And for the first time in my adult life, I didn't feel like a survivor. I felt like a woman who had been reborn in her own name, under her own sky, with her own light. Autumn came quietly, brushing the trees with amber and gold. The air grew cooler, the light softer, and with it came a kind of calm that felt earned, like the closing of a long, exhausting book. My life had finally settled into something that felt like peace, not the brittle kind that comes after chaos, but the kind that grows roots, the kind you can live inside. One Sunday morning, I brewed my coffee and sat by the window watching the leaves fall. The cottage smelled of cinnamon and wood polish. The radio played an old jazz tune, low and unintrusive. Everything about the moment was ordinary. Gloriously, beautifully ordinary. There was a time when I thought my story would end with rage or revenge or some cinematic explosion of justice. But real endings, I've learned, are quieter. They don't demand applause. They simply let you exhale. I thought back to that night, my 50th birthday, the golden lights, the laughter, the way his words had shattered something deep inside me. I'd imagined then that humiliation was a kind of death. In a way it was, but not mine, his. That version of me, the woman who smiled through disrespect, who made herself small to be loved, she had died too. And in her place, someone new had risen. I took out my journal and began to write, not out of pain, but out of gratitude. Gratitude for the strength I hadn't known was sleeping inside me all those years. Gratitude for the lessons that came wrapped in fire. Gratitude for the woman I'd become by walking through the wreckage. Halfway through my writing, the phone rang. It was Harper, my old investigator. "You'll never guess who I ran into," she said. "Surprise me." "Lauren, at a bookstore downtown." I paused, the pen resting on the page. "And how is she?" "Different," Harper said after a beat. "Older, quieter. She looked like someone who finally realized she wasn't special, just temporary." I smiled faintly. "We all realize that eventually." "You want to know what she said when she heard your name?" Harper asked. "No," I said softly. "Let her keep her version of the story. I've written mine." We talked for a few more minutes. Light conversation, nothing heavy. When I hung up, I felt an odd warmth. Not satisfaction, not nostalgia, just closure. The kind that doesn't need witnesses. That evening, I walked down to the lake as the sun slipped behind the trees. The air smelled of wet earth and memory. I carried with me one last thing, the external hard drive labeled insurance. For months, it had been my weapon, my safety net, the vault that held every secret, every proof. I had kept it locked away like a relic of war, but now it was just dead weight. I knelt at the edge of the water, pressed the cool metal in my hand, and whispered, "You served your purpose." Then with a slow, steady motion, I threw it into the lake. It sank instantly, leaving only ripples that shimmered in the dying light. The moment felt like the final act of surrender, not to defeat, but to freedom. As I stood there, a gust of wind lifted my hair, carrying the scent of the season: wood smoke, pine, and distant rain. Somewhere behind me, life continued. Children laughing, a dog barking, the faint hum of traffic. But out here by the water, time paused. I closed my eyes and breathed. I thought of my children, of the strength they'd found watching me rise. I thought of the women who'd whispered thank yous at that fundraiser, the strangers who saw courage in my quiet fury. And I thought of him, not with hatred, not even pity, but with something resembling forgiveness, because in his breaking of me, he had unknowingly built the foundation of the woman I was always meant to become. When I opened my eyes, the sun had nearly vanished, leaving a streak of molten orange on the horizon. I whispered, "Good night," to no one in particular. Maybe to the past, maybe to the woman I'd outgrown. Later, as night settled in, I sat on the porch wrapped in a blanket. The world was hushed, except for the low rustle of leaves. I poured a small glass of wine and held it up to the moonlight. "To endings," I said quietly, "and to the women who learn they're only the beginning." I took a sip, and it tasted like something I hadn't known in years: freedom. And as I leaned back, eyes half closed, a smile found its way to my lips. Not the practiced smile of politeness, not the tight one that hides pain, but the easy, unguarded smile of a woman who knows she owes no one an explanation. The kind of smile that comes when you finally understand that closure isn't given, it's created. And mine, at last, was complete.